So I guess before I open it up, and maybe some questions will come specifically about mental notes, since that's what we've just seen, but I wanted to say that the general push of this panel is to try and link how we talk about mental health, or how we talk about difference, how we talk about personhood, through film in particular, as a medium, and how we can do that in a way that pushes towards social change, how we can change the world for the better, as I'm sure, since you're all here, you really want to do.
What can a film do? How can it change the world? I think that a film like Jim's, and I was attempting in a film like mine, is that people want to be heard, people want to be seen, people want to feel. What was so devastating in Jim's film was listening to stories of people being restrained and then punished for trying to voice what they were feeling. And I think that documentary makers in particular, but also any filmmaker possibly, when you ally yourselves with people and stories that are maybe outside of the mainstream or outside of what's comfortable to talk about, but you find a person who can voice some of these, not necessarily injustices, but just, this whole other range of realities that are happening for people, then Jim can take that film, or I can take my film, and suddenly those people are able to speak to us. Jim has met those people. I haven't met any of them, but now I have heard, and now I'm forced to confront and contemplate what his film has brought to me. And I think that's one of the really important things that filmmakers can do, is collaborate with people who want to be heard, and that makes a dialogue, and I think dialogue can lead to different kinds of wellness, or that process of being connected to community, not being stuck within.
Yeah, storytelling, and then shared storytelling. Would any of you, and I should also, there are a few questions. I was just going to briefly ask something about your experiences, maybe specifically as the two filmmakers. Actually, you are a documentary maker, so I will include you. You did reveal that earlier. I'm an archivist, actually. He's making a documentary. But sneaky. So in your experience, what's it like making films with people when it can be a really deep and scary sort of topic or personal experience to work through? How do you do that ethically with people who might be really vulnerable, or like it's hard for us to tell our stories when they haven't been told before, and what can filmmakers do to make that an ethical, compassionate process?
If I could just put some context to that archivist filmmaker. It was funny, like I said in my talk, I was here 20 years ago making some cutting-edge drama from New Zealand television in the studio, doing the lighting actually, and I ended up getting into teaching. Didn't really make any film stuff back then, but I got into education first, and I learned how to media education to utilise the tools to get the students with NCA media studies to tell these stories, to find, especially I did push them towards documentary, which they did find particularly difficult. They like the little fantasies, escapist kind of cliches, but then they had to go out there and interact with the real world. So it is scary, it's a hard thing to do. And because you're accountable, because your audience is going to come, you're not a character, it's a real person, so you've got all those kind of things to consider.
For me, as a filmmaker, the most important question I ask is, who's telling the story? Who is the person that we are giving, or we setting up to communicate with us? And the background for Mental Notes is that it was essentially commissioned by the Frozen Funds Trust, which was an organisation that some of you may know, set up to actually hold confiscated patient funds. And they decided, after a bit of discussion, to reinvest some of the interest in projects like Peter's book, and in projects like Mental Notes. So for me, the voice of this had to be the consumer, the mental health consumer, the service user / resident /
Human being.
inmate / human being who has experienced this mostly traumatic contact with the healthcare system. And I think that framed all of my work in this area. And I knew that, for instance, putting a voiceover in was going to completely change that dynamic. I know because I tried. I know that there's some things we had to leave out because essentially it became a personal story of 5 main people that we saw evolve during the course of their history in institutions, and some things had to be left out as well. Essentially, a journalistic kind of approach was not possible if we wanted to preserve that voice, which just kept on coming again to us really, really strongly as we were editing it.
Okay, so I have a few questions, but I'll settle for one for now. I totally understand what you're saying about storytelling, and it's amazing that we've got films like this and this film festival that does explore these things and bring these kinds of works to a larger audience, but you can't deny the fact that all of us are here because we're interested in the subject. So how do you make sure that we get it out to the wider audience, to people who don't have an intrinsic interest?
I think that, there's not one answer to a question like that because, there are so many films out there and they're not all going to get seen and everyone hopes that theirs will be. But I think that when you're making films about things that people generally feel uncomfortable about, it's definitely something that you have to bear in mind in terms of how accessible your film is, because the more painful it is and the less commercial it is, in some ways the less easy it's going to be for television or film festivals to want to screen it. But then it comes down to the ethics again of why am I making this film? I'm sure Jim has some comments to make, but just a little bit of the context of the film that my short film became part of is a longer feature film called Assume Nothing, and there are 5 people in the film, whawhawhine, transgender, genderqueer. It's not real television material necessarily, plus it's full of nudity, people say the word cock, you're allowed to talk about breasts and show breasts, but anything to do with penises, you can't have on television. So I think you have to be sort of quite smart in terms of how you try and get it out there. Like, my film has screened on television in 5 countries around the world. It's screened at 60 different film festivals. It's travelled New Zealand. 200,000 people saw it in museums and art galleries. But it probably would never screen on television. So I think you need to make something that's really well made. The people in the film need to be treated in a really, well, not treated, it needs to be a collaboration that's respectful, and you need to find ways to find communities, because communities help spread films. I mean, nowadays it's not just television. You don't have to make something that's completely watered down and conventional. You can use the internet, you can use existing communities. I'm sure Jim has been networking with existing communities, and so you can't just sit there and say, oh, I made my film, why can't anyone see it? It's got to be, well made and speak a good truth, and then you have to work your butt off. When I finished, I spent 5 years making Assume Nothing, and I thought, oh, phew, that's finished. Well, I was delusional because it was just beginning. I spent, hours and hours, and you have to be committed. You have to be really passionate about what you're doing, and then you find other people and you persuade people, and there have been people who take films around in caravans. So when you're dealing with unpalatable ideas, or even just different ideas that are disturbing, uncomfortable, or just unusual, like people aren't resistant necessarily to the ideas that documentaries present, but they just haven't been exposed yet. So you have to help find a way to reach them. I mean, just looking at Jim's film, I'd say humour. Even though it's not a funny film, the gentleman who has the baby, he makes it really accessible for us because he has this lightness. And I think that humour and beauty are ways to really kind of like a Trojan horse help people open up to things that they would rather not.
I wish to know about the practice of electric shock treatment. Is that still permitted?
It is still
Yes, it
happening,
is,
yes.
Will it not? I think that so shouldn't be. And what is being done about it?
I'm a medical student, and I've just finished a psychiatry run, and actually electric shock therapy is pretty much the only really well-proven treatment for depression if it's treatment-resistant melancholic depression. And it's actually really effective, and it's not all barbaric, like the way that it's always been portrayed in film has been barbaric.
I think some people have experienced it as barbaric, so it's true on some level. And
definitely,
I can
but
recognise that there are different contexts, but I think this room is fairly full of people who would say it's a difficult topic, not one that we're going to resolve and say it's good or it's not good.
I think though it's important to recognise that it actually does have a place in mental health treatment.
According to the medical model that we work with, yes, and I think there'd be a lot of people who'd agree with you. That's
There
as far
also
as I
would be
go.
a lot who don't.
Yeah.
And there also, I just to maybe tail off with an anecdote about that. I was doing the Nutters Club, that radio show, on Live FM. Radio Live. Thanks, Mark. And me and Mike King, the big gun, he was over in South Africa. So me and David Gutaya were talking, and someone was a lady called in who was just scheduled for her first ECT treatment down at the Henry Bennett Centre in Hamilton. And we were talking about historic cases where, one of the people that I didn't, this comes back to your question, I think, one of the people I didn't use in my story had about 300 electric shocks, and she was missing kind of 5 years of her life, okay? So there was some serious overuse of ECT, and we're all familiar with that. But what emerged to us when this woman was talking to us on radio was that the doctor had not told her about any effects of memory loss. And
Risks.
it was a prescription for a treatment that may have been appropriate, but it felt badly placed. And I don't think that same clinician would give that treatment to, say, a mathematician who was 40 years old.
I think, and part of what we're talking about is consent, right?
Yeah.
So what is the context in which ECT is being administered, and does that person have a choice? Like a lot of
really
the stories
understand.
we've heard, people probably were not given a choice, and yeah, how much information is being shared? So if you're asking for someone's consent, or if you're given a prescription or this is what will fix you, then how much information is being shared, which is not a blame game on the particular professionals, but is about how much more information can we share and how much education do we need to be doing, and film is a good medium for that.
One of the things that I've noticed from Mental Notes is people, the success stories of the people that I followed when they came out of their bins, when they came out into the community. The most successful built links to the community. And I know we're in an organisation. We're being hosted by an organisation called Changing Minds. There are other organisations, consumer-based organisations, that are looking out for people, and I think it's a matter of joining up and becoming active in that. And maybe that's part of the reason you're here. There are also journalists who are involved in investigating issues. There's still current affairs programs, and I would encourage you to make friends with them as well.
I have a dream of working with Jim and other filmmakers on taking this to the next stage, the sequel. We could work on that. A lot of, and it is a point of learning, taking the learnings from the injustices of the past, and touching a little bit on what the earlier question about, there were a lot of good people working in the asylums, and there were a lot of good intentions. That the asylums didn't work for the staff just as much as they didn't work for the people in there. The storytelling is part of the healing process, and there are still some stories, negative horror stories to come out still. The next phase will be what to do with that, and part of what's happening with Changing Minds is that people who were subject to the asylums, like John Tovey in the movie, are working in mental health systems, and he was, you might have seen a little brochure he was stuffing in a kete there. That was a Buddies brochure, and that's a peer support service down in Wellington, where people who diagnosed with mental illness are working going into the inpatient units and working with people to transition out again, with the expectation that recovery is always going to happen, not with an expectation that you're never going to recover. It's, right, you're in here, this is a temporary situation for you, this is how we're going to help you when it's over and when you want to get back in to assume your social roles. So I think you're right, there's a bit of a change happening. We have to remember the old, but we have to look forward to what did work and what useful things we can take from what happened. I think that could be the next film.
Two things come to mind for me with what you're saying. One's to do with power and sort of shifts in power, because in the past, and still typically on television, like say 2020, and you see a program about someone, let's say it's someone in a mental institution or someone who's transgender, the camera crew and the director and the editor and the whole thing is sort of on the outside of a cage looking in and poking a stick at the freak.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of television has been, it's what a lot of mainstream drama has been, and to a lesser extent some documentaries been like that, like all the early anthropological films. Even though they had good intentions, they were poking a stick most of the time as well. So I think what we're seeing is a sort of a shift, because now people who are from the other side of that cage are making the films or are allied with people who are making the films. So I think you see a shift, probably, not necessarily in the mainstream as obvious, but I think as the power dynamic filters out and people are telling their stories, I think you'll see changes in those kind of representations where people are on the same side and not in a cage, but speaking out to the rest of the world. And then I think, like I used animation in my film, and I don't know if you remember, but there's a little sequence where Marnie's at the circus and all these, bearded ladies zipping by, and my teacher really strongly warned me against using the circus imagery because there's such a strong association with circus freaks, and the fact that Marnie's got a beard, and she said it's so dangerous, people are already possibly going to be thinking she is a freak and a monster, and then you take them to the circus and it's going to reinforce it. But I was like, no, I want to take that imagery, I want to take that, but make it joyful. You see the colours in Marnie's house, it's full of reds and oranges and yellows, she laughs, and I wanted it to be a joyful story. So you can take old cliches and old ways of representing them, but you can shift them, and people don't even realise it's happened, but all of a sudden they're in the cage with you and there's no bars. So I think that's another thing that all kinds of filmmakers can do, is challenge using those, you've got to think about it, and you've got to think about that power and then go, okay, how do we shift it?
And I can just add to that. I mean, the way the genre bending that's kind of happening now, and that you can, break away from the classical Hollywood kind of structures with cliches, and you might bring in some more social realism and stuff. I mean, Gregory King's a New Zealand director who's made some awesome indie, low-budget documentaries, Song of Good, and there's one of my favourites called Christmas, which he made in 2003, and it's like a documentary, but it's really dramatic, and it's all actors, and it's an incredible slice of life about family and coming together at Christmas and how all the dysfunctions come up around that time. It's really intense, and I'm just like, oh God, it's like this. I remember that scene, but there's that truth, eh? So if a filmmaker is good enough, and I think some of these young people coming through now have got these kind of skills to kind of nurse out, dramaturgy and performance that, you know, can be capture an essence, that will get through also. So there's a lot of exciting stuff. There's still incredible, like the horror genre is, you know, every stereotype still hammering you in the face. But do you watch that and just accept that, or do you, you know, just go to it and it's just entertaining? But it is. I think they're more conscious of the construction of what they're doing with these representations. One other interesting area I'd just like to just briefly mention is this thing, something like Beyond the Darklands. You know, has you been watching that? I mean, we've got drama conventions coming into documentary, and you can't have a documentary now without dramatisation, you know, in the mainstream. And I think those are quite dangerous. You know, he's got this kind of psycho speak, and yes, I'm really concerned about how this bad person was created. Yes, we've got all this trauma coming in. And then there's the dramatisation of back in, and he's lit really cool, spookily as well. And he's all part of a role, and, you know, that's a bit of slippage back. That's a backwards move, I'd say.
And I'd say there's some. Oh, well,
Yeah.
suddenly I'm loud.
Suddenly.
I was. Hey, I heard that. Something about difference when we were talking here too. Like, it's not just again, when changing minds, we don't want to silo off mental illness and say what are representations of madness and representations of mentally ill people like now, as if that's separate from discourses of sexism and racism and all that stuff. That's it's so tied up in that. That's a lot of where we get really stereotyped and stigmatizing images and media as well. So I think keeping that in mind, that there's a lot of linkages there that we definitely don't have time to go into, but that I wanted to draw attention to.